Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stacy Scott, Marketing and Client Relations Coordinator here at Wickham Financial Insurance Services, and I'm also your host for today. Thank you so much for joining us today for our September Lunch and Learn. We hope you enjoy this session and that you learn some valuable information. For this month's Lunch and Learn, we are featuring Graham Wickham, President and CEO of Wickham Financial and Insurance Services, as well as attorney Stan Faulkner of Faulkner Law Group. We'll start with Graham spending a little bit of time today talking about what's going on in the investment markets right now. And then he'll address some concerns that some of you may have. Then we'll turn things over to Stan. Throughout today's session, if you have any questions for Graham or Stan, please type them into the Q&A section of the chat box, and they will address those as soon as we wrap up. And just a reminder that you'll see Graham's calendar pop up from time to time during the presentation. If you would like to schedule some time to talk with him, please click on that calendar when it pops up and select the time that works best for you. And I guess it's time to get started. Graham?
Yeah, thank you, Stacy. And for our clients that are on the call, thank you. Our guests on the call, thank you all for being here. Each one of these lunch and learns, I'm trying to really bring some things that are a bit timely that I think are going to continue to add value, not just today, but things you want to think about as you go through your financial journey. So I'm excited to have Stan Faulkner with Faulkner Law Group, our attorneys that are in-house, to be on the call, and I'll turn this over to him in just a minute. But first off, I want to talk a little bit about volatility, what to expect in these markets, because we're getting a bit more anxiety right now, and I think that's absolutely natural. So let's think about where we've come so far. If we take and we just add up, and we're going to talk about the S&P index returns for the last 3 years, we're up almost 70%. If we think about from pandemic lows in the market, we're up over 100%. So I think it's reasonable to expect some sort of pause. And I know we've gotten 3-5% over the last couple of days. It seems like now we're rallying back to some portion. But I would still expect and encourage you to accept some volatility that we're going to get in this market. It might not be the end. We might see more of a pullback. So let's think about this. Since 1920, the S&P on average for 3 times a year has had a 5% pullback. Every 16 months, we've seen about a 10% pullback. And every 7 years, we've seen about a 20% pullback. Now, let's think about these 20% pullbacks. Now, in 2018, we had what was called in December, late December, I think it was a flash crash. The market really corrected. It's almost exactly at 20%. Now, in 2020, we had a 37% pullback in the S&P. So we've had some 20% pullbacks, right? So you're kind of like, well, you just told me a 7-year stat on the 20 years. Well, on the 20% pullback, well, it doesn't mean we might not still get that level of volatility. I never want to take that off the board. But I think it is clear right now some things that we just need to address with the markets and understand we're probably going to have a little bit of volatility.
Okay. Well, is this something that the average consumer really needs to be concerned with?
I wouldn't say lie awake at night over, but I definitely think if you're not solid in your plan, and I think anyone that works with us can say, we got a plan and strategy. We know where we're at, where we're going, hopefully where we're going to end up. And we've a plan, and you got to plan for this type of volatility. So I don't think be overly concerned, but I certainly would ask anyone that's listening to, if you need some added funds or you have some outside returns, I think it's okay for you to set some money on the side and accept that, hey, we've had some great returns. Hopefully you've had some great returns, and it's okay to take a little profit. Make sure you have good old-fashioned diversification inside the portfolio.
That makes sense. Well, with that in mind, are there any other steps that you'd recommend people to make given what you're seeing?
Well, and I think it comes down to good old-fashioned allocation and diversification in the portfolios. So let's think about this. Let's think about maybe stocks and bond allocation or what sectors. And I think it's going to come down to, is it okay just to have stocks? Well, I think it is generally okay, but let's think about where you own certain positions within the market, maybe certain sectors. The markets really haven't had a pullback from the averages like the NASDAQ, the Dow, or the S&P index. a couple percentage points off the high. But internally, certain stocks and certain sectors are down 10, 20, 30 odd percent. So the way we would generally think about it is maybe we want to start leaning towards, and this has got to be a part of your planning strategy, maybe we want to lean towards the things that have already corrected, that have great earnings, a great moat, great management, great cash flow, hopefully a great dividend yield. You know, that's one way that you can ride out or take advantage of some of the pullbacks without feeling like you got to get out, right? So let's think about another stat. Looking back since 1930, and we're looking at Bank of America coming up with a study, and they broke it down to every decade since 1930 for the S&P index. Do you know if you missed 10 of the best trading days in the S&P each decade since 1930, you know your return would be 28%. But if you stayed fully invested, your return would be 17,700%. Now, I don't have to probably make the statement of which one you would rather have, right?
Right.
Of course, we would all want that. It's not a guarantee for the future, but it is interesting to think about staying the course and what that'll do for you. Also, one other thing to think about, you know, 35% of active money managers, people active managing money in an active portfolio, they're the only 35% beat or exceed the index returns that they're tracking. So the majority can't even keep up with the performance in terms of their comparability or outperformance. So even the professionals have a really challenging time trying to time. Also think about it too. You could generate a lot more activity, a lot more taxes. Now, I'm not saying don't reposition, don't adjust. That's not what I'm saying. But I do think it is important to not get all in or all out. Maybe it's just trimming, maybe it's repositioning, maybe it's something like that.
Okay. Well, you know, for the most part, you've been talking about the stock market. Is there anything that we need to be aware of in the bond market?
Yeah, there's a lot of chatter there, and that's a great question. And we do. You know, think about it. We're in an environment where interest rates over the last 11 odd years, 12 odd years have basically been coming down, right, since the Great Depression that we saw in 2008 era. And what that has done, it's been hopefully spurring on some level of increased activity in loans to spur growth on, to facilitate a good bull market, right? Or facilitate or allow additional profits and revenues for corporations. You know, and as those interest rates have dropped so low, you know, what happens? Bond values generally go up, right? So we had some reasonably good returns in bonds over that period. But now we're in a period of a rising rate environment. So not necessarily is rising rates bad. It's not necessarily. It might turn into the pace of it. So it can be a little bit of trying to swim upstream with bonds. Because think about it this way. When you own a fixed income asset, and let's say you were an owner of older bonds, when interest rates rise, right, just being very basic in my statement, that's pressure on the principal values of those older bonds. Why? Because individuals buying newer bonds are buying at higher interest rates. So they might sell their older bonds, depressing their principal values, right, to buy newer bonds, all right? So again, it's not just interest rates rising. It can be the pace or how quick they rise, you know, that can affect. So what has that kind of done? That's pushed us out to take on more risk, be more cognizant of how we invest, and get away from seeing these traditional modeling of stocks over bonds and getting into a little bit more of an active management approach. So I think there is a struggle with bonds going forward. That doesn't mean it can't play a position or a role in your portfolio. You just got to see where it makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the questions I have right now. Just a reminder to our viewers, if you have any questions for Graham or for Stan coming up here in a minute, be sure and just type those into the chat box and we'll get them to address those at the end of the session.
Right. Let me, before I sound and I turn this over to Stan, I do want to also talk about some positives, right? Because no one likes to talk about, you know, always the negatives. It's not the sky's falling. That's not where I'm going at with this on the call today. But I just want our listeners to understand you got to accept volatility. It's going to come. But let's also, if we're going to think about some negatives, because no one likes anything to go down in value, let's think about the positives. You know, we got great demand by the consumer. We still have money hitting the consumer's bank accounts. checks in the mail, if you might. We have really low interest rates, and even if they go up, that's not necessarily a bad thing because that means demand's there. Revenues are hitting corporate earnings, which is great because we got strong corporate earnings, which means naturally inflation's a little bit higher. Let's think about some negatives here. Maybe evaluations in the markets, some geopolitical events, with the Chinese government cracking down, or at least some of their institutions putting some question marks on possible contagion in the financial institutions. So it's not just always negative or positive. I think we have a reasonable balance now that we can expect whatever pullback that we get in the market to some degree. I think consumers will come in and buy. Again, we'll have to see how that works out, but I would not doubt that would happen, Stacey.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me go ahead. Without further ado, I know Stan's waited with bated breath to talk a bit about TODs, PODs. I think we're going to talk about beneficiaries. And with the new 10-year rule, I'm excited to hear what Stan has to say on how we could combat that 10-year distribution rule that is now on beneficiary IRA. So Stan Faulkner with Faulkner Law Group, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Graham. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on this. So from the estate planning side, I just want to touch a few points here about consistency in making our estate plans. And when we sit down and meet with folks and we do a will-based plan, we always talk about how do we supplement that plan so as to avoid probate process as much as possible. And so that's why I'm going to talk about TODs, PODs, beneficiaries, joint ownership on accounts. And they're all different. And so I'm just going to try to be brief about each one of them, right? So a beneficiary is just somebody that you name or multiple people that you name that will receive an asset from you at your passing. And that asset can be all kinds. It can be a life insurance policy. It could be a retirement account. It could be some other custodian account. It could even be a bank account. And usually you're going to have multiples on there. Lots of times people will name their kids, 2 or 3 or how many, as beneficiaries. That's one way to do it. It allows you to divide things up. However, it does come with some issues depending on the type of asset that you name. So if you have CDs and you name beneficiaries, we have to talk about when do we liquidate a CD? Can we liquidate it? Is it going to be held for a while? Or some other types of assets that make it difficult to easily split up equally. So we need to be concerned about that and just be mindful of what asset we're naming as a beneficiary. Another possibility of that we use or we try to encourage people to use is a payable on death designation. Similar to a beneficiary, but not the same. A payable on death designation on a bank account or a credit union account is also known as a Totten trust. So it's a form of a trust that you are essentially creating for the person you're naming as a designated individual to receive that bank account. And generally speaking, a POD goes to one person named on an account. And so that has certain drawbacks to it as well, right? So if that person predeceases you and you still leave them on the POD, then their estate gets the funds. It doesn't flow back into your estate. And so you got to be mindful of that. Also, if we create a will, we don't want to be contradictory in naming this account to go to somebody in our will, but then have a POD for somebody else. POD wins, that designation will override the will. So we just need to be mindful of that as we're planning so that we're consistent in how we're doing it and we're not creating issues that don't belong there, right? You can also name minors as PODs as long as you've created a custodian in advance to manage it for them. Don't name them if you don't have a custodian set up, because then you've created a problem that probate court will deal with, okay? Another one is a transfer on death, TOD. This type of account is used in the brokerage services world. Graham uses these all the time, a lot of his accounts, and they allow the transfer of ownership of the account to a person. So we're not necessarily given an asset like we are at the bank account as a payable on death. We're transferring the entire account, its ownership level, to somebody else. And you usually do that because you're trying to delay a tax consequence. Right? So if you transfer ownership, that's not liquidating that asset. You're not going to suffer a capital gain on it. You're just delaying that gain for the next owner whenever they decide to cash it in or liquidate it. So also very useful, and it avoids the probate process. So it overrides your will. Again, we got to be consistent. in our will when we name TODs, PODs, etc. Okay. And so those are all three good uses of assets or ownership transfer when we have a will-based plan. And we encourage those just so that we're consistent in how we create the plan to minimize the use of the probate court, which is the whole point of estate planning. It's like we want to be out of court. And so we encourage folks to set those up and use them as they can. Now, another way to do that, and I'm going to be brief on this, is a joint ownership possibility, but that has all kinds of issues too, because you're actually owning an account. You give somebody ownership rights versus use of it after you pass. So you got to be mindful about when you set that up. Okay. And what I mean by mindful is that you may or may not want them to have ownership access to that account during your lifetime. Because once you give it to them, you can't take it back unless they agree to do so. And you create issues there. You create problems. Sometimes you create entitlement problems. People have the entitlement issues as like, well, it's mine now. I can do whatever I want with it. Legally, yes. But that's may not be what you intended to have happen when you created that ownership. So let's be smart about it and discuss it and talk through what the consequences are of any of these decisions in creating PODs, TODs, beneficiaries, et cetera, in the overall concept of our estate plan. So somebody asked me a question right now online. It says, the investment account asks for name of a designated beneficiary. Is that the same as a TOD? And the answer is no, it is not the same as a TOD. You can think of it sometimes in the same vein, but a beneficiary does receive the asset itself, not necessarily the account ownership, which is the point of a TOD. So it kind of depends on the account or the investment account or what we're put in there. I would be very specific in responding to whomever's managing that is to, do you mean a transfer on death for the account itself or the asset that's being held inside the account? Because you may have multiple assets in that account, multiple different types of assets in that account. So we want to be kind of smart about that and just be particular, just be specific about what we're doing on that. And just so that we manage it appropriately, we don't cause a tax consequence that we don't mean to. So I see I have a few minutes left before we get into some Q&A. So I want to talk then about IRAs, how they fit into our estate plan in regards to the new Secure Act that came out that has sort of thrown things upside down in terms of trust planning, particularly with the use of IRA assets. So it used to be that we would put a lot of IRA beneficiaries in trust for future use so that we could extend the use of that IRA for the lifetime of that trust and increase or grow its assets over time, right? So the Secure Act does away with that to some extent because the IRS was tired of not collecting its taxes on these tax deferred accounts. And so we've created this, the Congress created the Secure Act, and it's designed to require beneficiaries of an IRA to withdraw the entirety of that IRA within a certain period of time. And everybody defaults to the 10-year rule. And that's probably a good way to think about it, but there are a number of exceptions, and you can still do, and you still may want to consider trust planning as a beneficiary of that IRA in certain circumstances, okay? So generally speaking, 10 years applies. You got to withdraw the asset from the IRA when you inherit it. However, the spouse of the decedent account owner is excepted from that rule. So the spouse can keep it in for the longer of her life or the required distribution age of the account owner. So she has an opportunity there. She can also, as spouse, and I say she, but it could be a he that receives it, has the option to transfer it into her own or his own IRA account as well. So it's not entirely a 10-year rule. There is an exception for a spouse, which can grow it. The other exception is minor children of the account owner, the decedent. So if the account owner dies and the children are 10 years old and they're the named beneficiaries, they get to keep it in that IRA for their lifetime. So now we talk about a really big shift in estate planning, because it used to be that we wouldn't necessarily, and I wouldn't encourage people to designate a minor as a beneficiary of an IRA. Now we might want to in certain circumstances, because you can grow a small IRA to a large IRA over the lifetime of a child, right? A beneficiary. So you could talk about transferring $100,000 into, $1.5, $2 million over the life of that child, if you've planned appropriately and thought about, well, who would manage that as a custodian for them when they're minors? Would they be capable of handling it when they turn 18, or managing it when they turn the age of majority? And IRS rules are 18. So you need to think about it, but it's now not an automatic where we would just set it over to trust. Maybe we want to let the child have the exception. But that dovetails into the other part of that too, is you still may consider using a trust as a beneficiary for an IRA, depending on your beneficiaries. Maybe you have beneficiaries that have special needs, right? And you need to accumulate assets for them in something separately owned so as not to jeopardize their current financial situation with benefits, right? So you may create some type of an accumulation trust. Or you may have beneficiaries who have, debt problems or some other concerns that would prevent you from just giving them a lump sum in an IRA designation, right? Or beneficiary designation. So maybe you want to hold it over for trust in that case. And so you have to, I think what the Secure Act has forced us to do is you don't have sort of default rules anymore about, let's just put it into trust and let's manage it long-term and have it grow. We really need to examine all of the aspects. How much money do we have in that IRA? Who our beneficiaries are, what their needs are going to be. Is it worth it to pay the tax consequence to go ahead and move it when you die or within the 10 years? Because the benefit of the trust for that beneficiary far outweighs the tax consequence, right? So maybe what it's done more than anything is just forced us to, let's examine how we're dealing with the IRAs in the global picture of our estate plan, and make sure that it makes sense. And sometimes taxes aren't the threshold that we should consider. Maybe it's something else in regards to our plan. So while you do have exceptions to the 10-year rule, and you should try to maximize them for your beneficiary's sake in certain circumstances, you just need to consider all of the aspects of your entire plan, who your beneficiaries are, and what your ideas or goals are with those funds overall, before we just, automatically designate them to people. Okay. So that's our brief overview of what some estate planning tips for TOD, POD, etc. So, Stacey, I would say if there's any questions about any of those, we got about 2 minutes left before it's a Q&A. If there's anything that I missed about any of those designations and how they fit in, let me know.
Actually, yes, we did just get a question in. When would I use joint ownership instead of POD?
So I think it's probably a good idea to use joint ownership when you have a spouse and put them on there, because now you both have access during lifetime and you don't have to worry about getting access after death and proving it. It would just be automatic. That's a good way to do it. Sometimes I see it when I have an only child and an elderly parent, right? So my dad did that with his mom because he was an only child and he became joint owner of everything and then just received it. You don't have any estate problems in that case, right? You're not going to have any quarreling siblings and stuff like that. Absent those two circumstances, joint ownership can be difficult, can be problematic. Sometimes kids feel, if you have multiple siblings, you have people feeling left out or entitlement, concerns and those sorts of feelings. And so joint ownership isn't always the best way to go. The law would say this, and this is one thing to keep in mind, is when you designate somebody as a joint owner, even if they've contributed zero to that account, the law presumes they have 100% ownership of that asset inside that account. And so they can go in and pull out all of it. And sometimes people don't realize that. And so that's also something to be mindful of, is you may have created it, but you've just given it to somebody else by naming them as a joint owner. So got to be smart about it. Just think it through and ask somebody before you just do it.
Right. Great point, Stan.
Yeah.
Stacy, do we have some other questions?
Yes, actually we do for both of you. First of all, Graham, do we see a really big correction in this market?
I guess it's how you define a really big correction. So let's just run through the numbers of 5, 10, 20, since those are some general correction numbers I spoke about earlier. We've already had a 5% correction, at least on the S&P. I think intraday, day before yesterday, I think the S&P today was down about 5%. So there's your 5%. Maybe the other is, could it get worse before it gets better? I think yes. But that doesn't, again, mean that you make a big adjustment in your plan. Maybe there's some small tweaks, which I generally say small tweaks are better than big moves in light of this type of situation. But I don't know about a big 20+% correction, but I'll never rule that out.
Okay. Are there some areas that look a little more interesting right now than others?
Well, I kind of alluded to it earlier. I'm a big fan of, I like to think about it like a boat. Right. When everyone's on one side of the ship, that ship really leans over. So I like to start tiptoeing to the other side a little bit, not because I don't want to capsize, because I also want to take care of, opportunities. So I would probably look at what has really underperformed. Think about it in the context, what's the future, what's years down the road, could it have an opportunity to come back and outperform, maybe like some of the materials, industrials, maybe some utilities, maybe some of the banks that have really underperformed, maybe some of the cyclical areas where you might still have seen some of the growthier areas outperform. Because right now it seems to be a struggle between both. And I don't know if it's that you want to have one side or the other. I don't think that's the right mix. I really think, depending on your personal goals and objectives that you're trying to achieve, it should be just a good old-fashioned balance. But maybe look at some of the stuff that has really underperformed.
Yeah. Okay. Stan, I have one for you. What are some other basic estate planning considerations that I should make?
One thing I always start with is, what does our family makeup look like? Do we have minor children? Do we have a blended family? Second spouse with kids. Those are considerations that really form the basics of what type of plan we choose. So if we have minor kids, we have to talk about guardians for those minors. In worst case scenarios, we have to talk about custodians of financial accounts for them, because minors can't own property, and a lot of times you don't want to send things their way. If you have a blended family, then we have to talk about what assets are coming in and where they're going to go. So sometimes your retirement plan from your divorce may be designated for your kids. How do we deal with that in an estate plan with a blended family? Now we have a new spouse and they have kids, etc. What's our thought process on giving to both sides, and how? Maybe it is that we're segregating assets and we're going to set up trusts so that we guarantee our kids receive assets. It gets more complicated when you have blended families, right? So we start there as a consideration, because then that tells us which road we want to go down. So it's a fork in the road, if you will. It's like, left is a traditional family with minor kids, and we're going to start with a will as a basic starting point, right? It means we may use something else, but we're going to start there. Blended family, we're more complicated already, and we need to be thinking about that and planning ways around that to make it easier. So that's my biggest consideration when we start a plan, is what does our family look like? Not necessarily assets, right? I mean, if you own a house, let's make an estate plan, right? So I start with our family first, and then I think about our assets, because then the assets just level on top of that basic building block.
Stan, I'd like to add something to that. When we teach our classes and courses, one thing I like to point out is everyone has a will and a wish on how they want the things that are important to them designated to the ones and things that are important to them, right? But it's not necessarily putting a price tag on things. This might be you want control while you're alive or after you're passed. Is that a reasonable statement? Because I think a lot of people or a lot of consumers get caught up in, well, I don't need to do any estate planning, or because, I don't have a lot of money. And I don't think it is about the money, right?
No, it shouldn't always be about the money, right? It should be about even the stuff that you have, how do you want to designate it, and where do you want it to go? You could have you may not be a wealthy person, but there could be certain family items that are super important. And you want to make sure that those make it their way to a certain individual that's going to take care of them, right? A lot of times what we see is heirlooms causing the biggest problem in an estate, because those are the things that our heart attaches to more than the money. Now, money always can lead to issues, but a lot of times people will have disputes about heirlooms, right? Mom always told me I could have this, and it's super important to me. I played with the dolls, you never did. Trust me, those things are huge. And so you don't have to be rich, but if you have certain items that you want, we need to be thinking about them, right? And making a plan around that so that it gets to the right place. I will say one thing that you said is everybody has a will and a wish. They're not the same thing, right? So I wish certain things would happen. I have no control over a wish, but I do have control over will. And I can designate where things go. And so that's the idea of a will, is I'm for certain saying this is what's going to happen, versus a wish is something I hope happens.
It's a great point. Stacy, I think our time is running a little low here.
It is. I do have someone just shot in with one more quick question. I hope that it's a easy answer for you, Stan. The investment accounts ask for the name of a designated beneficiary. Is that the same as a TOD?
I saw that earlier. I did respond to it briefly before. It's similar, and they may mean a TOD. The custodian may mean a TOD, but it's not the same. So they are legal terms. Beneficiary and transfer and death are two different things. So you just want to ask about it and make sure that maybe that's what the custodian intended, and maybe they didn't. So you just want to ask.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Graham and Stan, for your valuable information. And I think a lot of people are interested in both of these topics. Thanks also to our viewers for joining us today. And we hope to see you again next month for our Lunch and Learn. Until then, please remember to follow us on Facebook and check out our website to view our weekly wrap-ups, recommended articles, and other valuable information. Thank you again, and have a great afternoon.
Take care.
Thank you.